racism, imperialism, and neo-colonialism on the ground, some of whom we'll hear from today. Just a brief note on the event. The event is being recorded and will be available, an edited version of the event will be available on YouTube later on. If you have any questions for the panelists, please just put them in the chat or in the chat of the live stream, and they'll be relayed to the speakers. And just maybe specify who your question is for. We'll now move on to Cecil Gutzmore, who will give us a general introduction to the conference.
Thank you, Comrade Kevin. Let me utter warmest revolutionary greetings to you, whatever your virtual or actual location, as sisters, as brothers and comrades. US imperialism assassinated Walter Rodney at the early age of 38 on this day 40 years ago. Members of his family hold this day sacred, keeping it unto themselves, and could not for that reason join us or others. We acknowledge their grief and pay homage to their fortitude in the face of the loss of a devoted husband, father, son, and brother. Now, imperialism's policy of murder, which is expressed in the killing of Walter, was par for the course in that region at the time. And that the murder was carried out for US imperialism on behalf of by the Guyana government is crystal clear and is proven by documentation which has been available in a report since the 2016. As I say, that kind of activity was par for the course by US imperialism at that time. A few days after the killing of Walter, a bomb exploded under a platform in the capital of Grenada. On that platform was meant to be almost all of the principal leaders of the Grenada Revolution. 2 little girls were killed as a result of that. Now, we know that a judge in the United States Supreme Court once said that Africans, whether free or enslaved, have no rights that white power have to recognize or certainly have to recognize. And so that is a situation that we're still in. He was speaking a systemic and important truth. So nothing has changed in relation to how imperialism regards us Africans more than 100 years after that statement was made. So on this day, we think it is justified, especially in the light of the struggle that's being conducted worldwide in the aftermath of the death that my comrade Kevin just mentioned. And so we are proud to be able to locate this conference on the theme of imperialism and its neo-colonial violence. The neo-colonial violence is everywhere. It's in Haiti, which we might very well hear from later on. It's all over Africa, it's in the Caribbean. And so we are proudly focusing on that as the issue. And we believe that it honors Walter Rodney, who was the most dramatic and terrible of its victims. Thank you.
All right, so next up in the program, we'll have a poem. So from Nisel Mohammed Heinz. She graduated from Stanford University in 2019 with a Bachelor of Science in Physics and a minor in creative writing. She will start a physics PhD at the University of Washington this fall. Growing up in Guyana and in the US as a Black passive woman, she has seen firsthand how the inequalities that plague different countries have systemic roots in colonialism. As a budding scientist, poet, and educator, she works towards building a world where we can all learn without societal barriers. The poem that she'll be presenting today is called Today.
Thank you. Today, it is 93 degrees, and again, I bury myself in a blanket, freezing. Here lies my peace of mind. To be Black in the eyes of white supremacy is to be haunted by my own breath. I choke on the ghosts of too many stolen voices lodged in my throat, and the fear, the over your shoulder fear of being next. What can I say when nothing ever seems to change? I am because we are. George Floyd, Eric Garner. I can't breathe, we can't breathe. Another day, I will breathe and speak into existence a world and community. Another day, we are because I am, but not today.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that poem. That was really, really great. So next, before we start the conference proceedings, we're going to have a little musical interlude by Jota Ramos and Ukaga Mishawano, who will be presenting a piece for us. They're a musical collaboration between African youth in South Africa and Colombia, and they'll be giving a musical interlude entitled Walter. So look out for that next.
El año 80 mataron a Walter, nadie se dio cuenta, callaron la historia en los años 60. Rodney la vivió, la escribió con conciencia, familia de clase obrera. El hombre estudió becado con solo 24, ya tenía un doctorado. Los capitalistas lo tenían fichado, porque este hombre es un negro formado, peligro para blanco que se ha presentado, colorín colorado, este baile terminado. La violencia conservadora quiso acabar con su historia, pero su legado vive aún en nuestra memoria. Detrás del hombre de un gran luchador, panafricanista con mucho valor, en sus escritos representó a la masa de tierra como tú y como yo. Detrás del hombre de un gran luchador, panafricanista con mucho valor, en sus escritos representó a la masa de tierra como tú y como yo.
Because it is an act of identification. We are saying that we identify with the African people of the African continent. We are saying that we are an African people. When we make this identification, have no illusions about the fact that this is a very revolutionary initiative. It is a rejection of every
on the stage when I break the chain, fight the power and bring the change. Held us down and ain't in this way. 400 years and it's still the same. Bust the size and we feel the pain. Corporations from the USA, Chinese companies still the same. Sucking us dry like parasites. Now they own these paradise. Now we start really at the wise, giving a shit like 9 to 5, making it hard to organize. Stay down, trouble people power they are. Snakes and pretty flowers they are. Lies and peace and purpose in ya. Chinching dabas, tunis tabas, punum tabas, punum damas, pudi chaba, wo baba, puni tabas, ozo sab, zonkin babas, kiku tabas, yanko nyamas, yanko yana, zaluk bandwa, mekuwan.
Not only for mainland China, but for Malaysia and for the Chinese in North America. But look on the Africa and the Africans. The only entries on the Africans relate to the continent itself. There are no entries on the Africans overseas. There is no such category. Africans who have been raped from the continent mysteriously disappear and become Negro.
Perfect. So we're now on track to get going with the first panel of the day. The first panel of the day will be focusing on the Caribbean and South America. And the first speaker we have on this panel is Cecil Gutzmore, who we've heard from earlier. Cecil is African-Jamaican. He's a retired academic and remains fully committed activist in the struggle for race, class, and gender liberation. He'll be speaking to us about Walter Rodney on and against imperialist neo-colonialism, with particular reference to Guyana. Let's welcome Cecil.
Thanks again, Comrade Kevin. In the brief time available, what I want to do is to explore Walter's praxis under the title that you've already given in relation to neocolonialism. As a revolutionary intellectual, it is well known that he engaged directly against three specific neocolonies, two in the Caribbean, Jamaica and Guyana, and also the third in East Africa, Tanzania. It's important that we understand that you cannot fully understand Walter's stand against neocolonialism if you focus exclusively on that level, because Walter also approached neocolonialism at a higher and different level. That level is constituted by the relationship between neocolonialism and imperialism, and it's focused on an understanding of what neocolonialism therefore is, how long it's been in existence, and how it functions, particularly in the continent of Africa, but also in the Caribbean. So the best way to grasp Walter's dealing with that higher level is to look at a paper that he wrote for the Sixth Pan-African Congress in 2074, which he didn't deliver, but it became immediately available. It was actually delivered at the Congress, but he wasn't there. And what he does in that paper is to put class analysis at the center of his approach to Pan-Africanism and to revolutionary Pan-Africanism specifically. So it matters that Walter brought to his analysis of Pan-Africanism, and remember that he was both a Marxist and a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. So he brought his Marxist analysis, which are both historical materialism and scientific socialism, combined with his revolutionary Pan-Africanism. And just as he drew on Karl Marx, he also drew on significant African figures, including Kwame Nkrumah and others. A list of them needs to be understood, but we haven't got time for that today. Now, in that 1974 paper, Walter emphasizes that the African neocolonial leadership, and it's specifically bourgeois nationalist class fraction, betrayed the African masses in a whole series of ways. He analyzed their shameless, self-destructive embrace of imperialism, Congress of Berlin derived balkanization of the continent of Africa. He emphasized the willingness of that class faction cravenly to institutionalize that white power-derived version of Africa in the charter and arrangements of the Organization of African Unity, and later on as it appeared to be reformed in the African Union and in NAPAD that accompanied that reform. Those structures and processes reflect imperialist interest, not African interest, and Walter stressed that. He emphasized the pettiness of the vision and achievement of this neocolonial class, and he says that it comes out ever more clearly when you compare them to the stance and achievement of their imperialist masters. Walter talked about the self-deceiving acceptance of the reading of direct foreign capitalist investment by that neocolonial class. They join with imperialism in reading foreign direct capitalist investment as benevolent and as necessary. And Walter shows, it's important that it's understood that he shows that there is no benefit to any third world, African, Caribbean, Latin American country from direct foreign capitalist investment, that what it is a specific mechanism of exploitation, and that the exploitation cannot happen without that mechanism being in place. So nothing benevolent about it. And Walter makes that crystal clear. Beyond the paper that I was just mentioning, he has a lecture in which he does this in a most important way. There are several other points that he makes in that paper, and maybe we haven't got time to go into all of them. What matters is that he did have this view of Pan-Africanism that runs counter and contra to the class fraction that was running the African continent, and also that was in power or in office in the Caribbean. And so it follows almost that he was bound to run into trouble in those three neo-colonies in which he functioned. So I want to deal briefly with them. We know that he was in Jamaica as student and lecturer. We know that he familiarized himself with Jamaica while he was there, and in the first instance as student, and then that when he went back, now equipped with his PhD in African history, that he didn't stay within the academy, but took his message, which wasn't just arcane African history, but also a class analysis of that history, including that history in the Caribbean. And he took that onto the gully banks and into the ghettos of Jamaica. And that neo-colony at the time was run by a notoriously backward section of the class fraction I'm talking about, and that oppressed the people and Walter. And so he left Jamaica to deliver a speech in Toronto, and when he returned, they excluded him. The effect of that was to cause a riot because people understood what his role had been, and they also understood why it was so wrong for the government to exclude him. His impact on Jamaica is kind of documented in The Groundings with My Brothers, which is the book to read for that. Now, his encounter with Tanzania was a little bit more subtle, because Tanzania was formerly a more progressive state, nation state, than was Jamaica, and certainly than Guyana, where he later went. It matters that the leader there, Julius Nyerere, was engaged in a form of African socialism, and that presented problems for how the class analysis to which Walter Rodney was committed was actually to be brought out. And so there are different accounts of how he surfaced, but we have his writings, and the writings insist that the class struggle is taking place in Tanzania, that you can talk about it as silent, but it is also noisy, and that the interest of the African masses is what matters in that as in any other neo-colony. I heard from somebody who was a vice president of Tanzania that the president of Tanzania actually offered Walter the co-presidency of Tanzania. I've never heard that said anywhere else, but A.N. Babu said that while we were organizing the 7th Pan-African Congress together in London. Let me move swiftly. Now, before I move, please let it be understood that Walter wrote coherently and very sharply, and from a seriously class-based perspective, on the nature of the Tanzanian experiment, if you will. Now, he left there in 1974 to go back to his country of origin. And when he went there, it was already calling itself the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. And we know that the people who ran it killed him. So, and we also know that he was warned, including by them, about not returning there. We know that the chair in history to which he was appointed, that the government cancelled that. We know that things like printing presses, which they ordered in, were denied them. We know that even Gesnet-Testner machines, they sabotaged. We know that his wife was denied certain kinds of employment. We know that they mocked him in relation to those matters. And so Walter was in a violence-steeped environment, facing people who were willing to use that violence and had killed other people before they got to him. This is well known and well documented. So there are issues about whether, for example, like or unlike the Grenadian leadership of the New Jewel movement, which the year before he was killed had actually taken state power in Grenada by armed struggle, by armed means. So we need to understand where Walter stood on that. There is no evidence, or no evidence that is convincing, that he was actually engaged in armed struggle. There are all kinds of issues relating to how he disposed himself in relation to the working class movement. It's a place with a fully developed labor movement, trade unions, etc. And he had at least one opportunity to put himself at the head of that movement, which out of principle, he declined to do. And so there came a time, and let me just say that the violence in that state had been carried out not just by the state itself, but by agents that they had imported, including a man called Rabbi Washington, who was there as an ostensible African nationalist, but was in fact simply a killer acting on behalf of the government of Guyana. So Walter was menaced in all those ways. Now, there came a time in the year 1980, when he went to Zimbabwe in that independence moment, where he overshadowed the leader in Guyana, where he overshadowed Burnham, and all kinds of resentments related to that, all kinds of unwillingness, responses to Walter's unwillingness to see that Guyana was not a place for him, his complete unwillingness to withdraw from the struggle meant that they eventually came for him. Let me just register Walter's extraordinary historical achievements as a historian, I mean, whilst he was in Guyana. It's important to understand the thoroughness with which he understood Guyana, having previously understood at a world-class level several regions and issues within the continent of Africa and the African diaspora. So that work by him matters. It matters also that Walter never for a moment doubted that alliances were necessary between peoples, including the races and classes within Guyana. Walter thought and spent a lot of his academic work on Guyana, bringing out the fact that the Guyanese revolution had to be made between strata and groups within Guyanese society, between which there were no antagonistic contradictions. And he firmly believed that there were no such contradictions between the Indians and African masses in Guyana. And his party and his whole orientation was towards bringing those two forces together to bring out and bring about the African Revolution. He was crystal clear that in the absence of such an alliance, in the absence of coherent, united class action between the two main working class forces in Guyana, imperialism would maintain its control and exploitation of that place. So Walter's historical work has, on Guyana, as on the continent of Africa, has very serious and urgent implications for the politics of Guyana, and indeed for the politics of this moment worldwide. The issue of class alliances, the issue of interracial alliances is being brought to the fore by what is happening on our streets today. And in that regard, Walter's work in apparently obscure Guyana is absolutely as relevant to what is happening on the streets of Washington or Seattle or New York or London as was the case in 19th century Guyana or 20th century 1970s Guyana, at the end of which decade he was killed. I think I want to leave it there.
I think it should have switched to me for a second, but I can just introduce Melinda quickly now. So Melinda Janki is an international lawyer who has worked in the oil industry and on projects for international financial institutions, including the World Bank. She's also admitted to practice as an attorney at law in Guyana. She'll be speaking to us today about the World Bank and Guyana's petroleum reserves, a neo-colonial project.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And greetings from Georgetown. Dr. Walter Rodney was a great historian. He was also an intellectual revolutionary. In Walter Rodney Speaks, he said, "I've always made the point that one's political contribution should come out of one's principal work activity, whatever that happens to be. My principal work activity is law. This is my small political contribution. I will show why Guyana's exploitative deal with ExxonMobil's subsidiary and partners is neo-colonial. Then I will focus on the World Bank as a neo-colonial institution promoting a neo-colonial governance project. The project does various things. I'm going to look at one aspect, which is the attempt to burden Guyana with the unwanted associated gas. This neo-colonial exploitation is facilitated by what Dr. Walter Rodney called the agents or unwitting accomplices of the neo-colonial system. In December 2019, ExxonMobil said it had produced oil from the Liza Phase 1 development. Guyana officially became an oil producer. Guyana's petroleum development is a classic neo-colonial project that benefits the oil companies, not Guyana. Oil companies are rich because they exploit developing countries. Guyana owns the oil. The oil companies, Esso Exploration and Production Guyana Limited, Hess Guyana Exploration Limited, and CNOOC Nexen Petroleum Guyana Limited, take 87.5% of the oil that is produced. They don't pay Guyana for this oil. Guyana gets what is left, the remaining 12.5%, and pays somebody to collect it and sell it. The oil companies don't pay a royalty except on oil sold, and the rate is 2%. They pay no tax, they pay no duties. The minister said they could recover pre-contract costs, which rack up to about $1 billion. So the government's attempt to make money from oil has cost the Guyanese people at least $1 billion. The environmental permit for this Liza 1 says Esso can discharge 4,000 barrels of sewage into Guyana's ocean every day. Over the proposed life of Liza 1, that is about 1.4 billion gallons of sewage. Liza 1 has about 1.4 billion barrels of recoverable oil. So Guyana gets roughly a gallon of sewage for every barrel of oil in Liza 1. That tells you what they think about Guyana and the Guyanese people. The International Development Association is part of the World Bank Group. It lent Guyana $20 million to improve governance in the oil and gas sector. That looks helpful given the disastrous deal with Esso, Hess, and CNOOC Nexen. Look more closely. The World Bank is not a benevolent institution. It is not a neutral technical entity. It is a neo-colonial body. It is an international organization set up by treaty under international law. Where did international law come from? From the conflict between colonizing European powers and the colonized. international law justified the conquest, enslavement, torture, and killing of non-Europeans, and the theft of their lands and natural resources. Decolonization has not removed the economic structures that colonization put in place. Developed countries always take developing countries' resources as cheaply as possible. That's why developed countries are rich and developing countries remain poor. The World Bank is controlled by the developed countries. When IDA lends money, IDA acquires power to tell a borrower state how to develop. Guyana wants to replace its heavy fuel oil with 100% renewable energy. Guyana said so in its contribution under the Paris Agreement. Does IDA lend Guyana money to move to renewable energy? No. IDA's loan is to promote oil and gas and to get Guyana to take the unwanted associated gas. Associated gas is a worthless product. Countries routinely flare it because nobody will buy it. IDA says it will help Guyana to prohibit routine flaring. IDA wants Guyana to join the World Bank's Zero Gas Flaring Initiative. Don't be fooled. This initiative doesn't mean zero flaring. It actually allows routine gas flaring until 2030. So if Guyana joins the World Bank initiative, ESSO would get to flare gas until 2030. Problem. ESSO's environmental permit already prohibits routine flaring. So under Guyana's legal regime, ESSO cannot do routine flaring. So IDA says, change the law. That is direct political interference in Guyana. Who was hired in 2019 to draft the law? A firm by the name of Hunt and Andrews Kurth. The international press say that this firm have been ExxonMobil's lawyers for over 40 years. It seems that Hunt and Andrews Kurth also has some sort of relationship with the World Bank. Their website boasts that when the World Bank wants international legal advice for African governments, the World Bank most often turns to Hunt and Andrews Kurth. Guyanese citizens wrote to the president of the World Bank asking how this firm could hold Guyana's interests paramount if they apparently wanted to be the World Bank's preferred choice of law firm. The World Bank has not responded, but an article in the Guyana press last week says that the firm has now withdrawn. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Dr. Rodney pointed out that underdeveloped countries recruit foreign experts at fantastic cost. The IDA project allocated 437 million Guyana dollars for the law firm to draft some new laws. In comparison, Guyana's budget allocated 456 million for the Attorney General's chambers for the whole of 2019 to do all the legal drafting in Guyana, plus all government litigation and legal advice. Under this neo-colonial arrangement, a foreign law firm was going to get almost as much as the AG's chambers to do a fraction of the work. Now, flaring is dangerous. It emits greenhouse gases that make the earth hotter, disrupts the climate system, makes the oceans more acid, and makes sea levels rise. Not good when your capital city is below sea level. IDA claims they will help Guyana to cut emissions from the flaring by using the associated gas as a transition fuel. So IDA creates this problem of flaring, because ESSO isn't allowed to flare at the moment. Then IDA solves it by burdening Guyana with the unwanted associated gas. Gas pipelines and infrastructure cost millions of dollars. Guyana would be locked into natural gas for 20 years. Why can't Guyana use the money instead to give everybody cheap, reliable energy, including the Amerindian communities in the interior? Natural gas is not a bridge fuel. It's bad for the environment compared to any fuel, really, but compared to the renewable energy that Guyana wants to use. Why does IDA want Guyana to take the associated gas? ESSO is legally required to re-inject the associated gas. In the last few weeks, Guyanese have been outraged to hear that ESSO is not re-injecting that gas. They flared over 9 billion cubic feet since starting production in December, and they're flaring millions of cubic feet every day They say they have a technical problem. If Guyana does what Ida wants and takes the associated gas, obviously the costs move from Esso to Guyana. Problem. A World Bank report says that Guyana has little or no domestic market for gas. Ida already knows that the Guyanese people could end up paying for gas that they cannot use. They don't care. The World Bank supported a gas project in Ghana. Last year, Ghana's bill for unused gas from an offshore gas field was $250 million US. Dr. Rodney says, racism, violence, and brutality were the concomitants of the capitalist system when it extended itself abroad in the early centuries of the international trade. Racism, violence, and brutality continue today. In another project supported by the World Bank, communities in Mozambique were supposed to leave their ancestral lands so gas infrastructure could be built. Some communities didn't leave and were attacked. Around 700 people have reportedly been killed. In the United States, the murder of George Floyd is a heartbreaking tragedy that has come out of systemic racism, violence, and brutality against Africans for more than 400 years. It's more than enough. Dr. Rodney said that oppression follows logically from exploitation, so as to guarantee the latter. Will the Guyanese people heed the warning from Guyana's own brilliant intellectual revolutionary? Why cling to false promises of wealth and false hopes of getting ExxonMobil to renegotiate? When you have exploitation, the next step is oppression. The exploitation is facilitated by the agents and unwitting accomplices of neocolonialism that Dr. Rodney warned about. People in Guyana who promote and defend this neocolonial venture. For example, the minister who signed the 2016 petroleum agreement with the abusive and exploitative terms. The individual who signed the World Bank loan agreement in April 2019 as Minister of Finance, when constitutionally he stopped being Minister of Finance after the no confidence motion in December 2018. The former advisor to the president on petroleum, who told the Guyanese people to trust the oil companies, who was in the press pushing for Guyana to take the associated gas, and even says, myself and the IDB were pushing for a comprehensive feasibility study of the whole coastline so as to pick the best location for the landing of the pipeline on shore. Must Guyana's sustainable development and the future of its young people be sabotaged for a pipe dream to benefit oil companies? The agents and accomplices would reduce Guyana to a supplier of raw materials, oil, and a consumer of unwanted associated gas. In true neo-colonial style, the financial power of the developed countries is being used to get Guyana's resources cheap and fast, leaving Guyana with unwanted gas and sewage. But Guyana has an alternative future. Developed countries are rich because their oil-fueled development has locked the earth into dangerous global warming. Now they must repair that damage. There is no carbon budget. Developed countries must not buy oil from Guyana's exploitative oil deal. They must pay Guyana to leave the oil 2 miles below the seabed. Guyana is a carbon sink. Pay Guyana for every net ton of greenhouse gas that Guyana takes out of the atmosphere. The earth faces human-induced mass extermination of biodiversity. Pay Guyana to conserve and protect the marine life in Guyana's ocean, which is threatened by oil production. When Guyana's people, and Guyana's resources are respected and valued, then we will know that neo-colonial exploitation is coming to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Melinda. So as the next speaker, we'll have Nazaire Saint-Fort. He's a graduate of the State University of Haiti's Faculty of Agronomy and Veterinary Medicine. He's been a country director for the University of California's Haiti Initiative and has helped to complete a human rights report for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's also developed a dairy cooperative in the South Department of Haiti and has worked with, among others, Swiss TV, BBC Radio, CBS National Television, Al Jazeera, and has co-authored articles on Haiti for the Interpress Service, IPS, and other outlets. So he'll be speaking to us about the latest uprisings in Haiti. Welcome, Nazaire. I think we can't quite hear you yet, Nazaire. Can you hear me, Nazaire? You might need to unmute yourself on the stream, on the Zoom app. There's a button where you can.
Are people hearing me?
Yeah.
This is not Nazaire, I don't think. In fact, I know it's not Nazaire.
Okay, then we'll have to move on to the next one.
Yes, please do so.
So next, sorry about that technical difficulties there. So next up we'll have, we'll have Lloyd D'Aguilar, who's a human rights activist, radio journalist. He runs a radio program called Ring the Alarm. He's a documentary filmmaker as well. In 2010, he founded the Tivoli Committee to represent the people who had been massacred in the Tivoli Garden Massacre, a struggle which is currently ongoing. So he'll be speaking to us today about the Jamaica Tivoli Garden Tivoli Massacre, command responsibility, and the construction of neo-colonial impunity. So we'd like to welcome Lloyd now.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
We are currently in the midst of one of the most serious crises of the international capitalist system, perhaps more serious than the Great Depression of the 1930s. The difference this time around is that the crisis doesn't stem from the crisis of overproduction and hence the usual closure of businesses and layoff of workers in order to protect profits. This time around, it is the state which is locking down the economy in order to protect us from a virus that most likely was produced in a lab and was produced because imperialist states need to have biological weapons at their disposal in case there is a third world war. That is how I see that. It is not my intention to get into the pros and cons of the science behind why the international ruling class felt that the best way to deal with the coronavirus pandemic, but their decision has had serious social consequences and we have to deal with them. Mass employment and serious economic decline. The second contributing factor to this crisis of capitalism is the worldwide protests that have broken out in response to the violence of the US state machinery, which is used against African Americans. It is now clear that it is not only the American state which is racist and violent. States all over the world use police violence to keep the working class and the poor in check, including Jamaica, as I shall go into in more detail shortly. The overarching point, however, is that this crisis of capitalism has exposed the capitalist system in such a way that the validity of the need for socialist revolution could never be more clear. no one can call you an ultra-leftist for advocating the need for an anti-capitalist revolution, and a worldwide one at that. That is why this Walter Rodney conference is so timely in terms of celebrating Rodney's contribution to the worldwide struggle for socialist revolution, and which is now so clearly on the agenda. Time is limited, so I want to get straight to how Rodney's intellectual and political contribution is of assistance to where we stand. As I see it, essentially, Walter Rodney was a revolutionary intellectual and activist. He was not an academic. Indeed, the government of Guyana, headed by its president, Forbes Vernon, prevented the University of Guyana from employing him during the time of his return to Guyana, just prior to his assassination. Walter Rodney was therefore an unemployed or unemployable revolutionary activist. It is therefore an important point to make that his political life exemplified the dialectical relationship between theory and practice. In other words, he wasn't an armchair revolutionary. He was out there on the street doing political work. And so in many respects, he was similar to Che Guevara. When we look at a country like Jamaica, where I live, the gap between the rich and the poor is one of the widest in the world. 20% of the people live below the poverty line. And I would say that, that currently, since the COVID-19 pandemic, the unemployment rate has shot up to about 20%. And there was a time when it used to be around 25% as the norm, right? That used to be the norm. It supposedly has gone down recently, but the poverty rate and the gap between the rich and the poor remains almost permanent. These basic statistics can go up and down, of course. You know, the government will claim that this happened, that happened. But as I said before, the basic social conditions remain the same. And the state is acutely aware that unemployment, poverty, the gap between the rich and the poor, and other forms of social oppression, such as corruption, that is the siphoning off of wealth produced by the working class, creates conditions which can produce social instability and violence. And this violence can be criminal or revolutionary in response to this crisis and social instability. So the state therefore prepares itself to confront either form of violence, revolutionary or criminal. They love to label everything as being criminal. But the bottom line is that state violence is designed to protect the oppressor capitalist class and the capitalist economic system, which exploits the labor of the working class. That is the basis of how the state violence is constructed. Another relevant theoretical point that is important to make, and also connected to Walter Rodney, is the nature of this poverty, this gap between the rich and the poor, that is rooted in economic underdevelopment. And what do we mean by economic development? Well, first of all, Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa goes into the history of how this underdevelopment came about. I'm sure that most people in this conference are acquainted in one way or another with the history of Europe's pillaging of Africa through the slave trade, military conquest, and the establishment of colonialism. So there's no necessity to get into that, but it is the foundation of how Europe took control of Africa and set up a colonial system and established a relationship between Europe and Africa. I think Rodney's concluding chapter, Colonialism as a System to Underdevelopment, Colonialism as a System for Underdeveloping Africa, taken from his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and that has been mentioned, is a chapter that gets into the nitty-gritty of the mechanism for transferring wealth or capital from the colony to the imperialist country, which is what is the root of underdevelopment, the transfer of wealth and capital from the colony to the imperialist country. And he wrote about that, he showed the mechanism of that. And the transfer of this wealth and capital is what causes economic development in the imperialist countries and economic underdevelopment in the colonial countries. So the European powers transfer wealth and they become wealthy and powerful, and in the process, it creates economic underdevelopment in the colonial countries where the wealth and the capital is taken from. There is, of course, class divisions and poverty in the developed countries, but it is far more severe in the underdeveloped countries. So even though we talk about developed countries, doesn't mean that they don't have their social crises as well, but their social conditions are far superior to, far better than what it is that we in the colonial countries suffer and the neo-colonial countries suffer as a result of this underdevelopment. And hence, some of the horrific forms of violence used to keep the neo-colonial ruling class in power. In other words, violence now becomes the means by which the neo-colonial ruling class keeps itself in power as a result of the crisis of underdevelopment and poverty. So time is limited, and I'm not going to get too deeply into this, but I've been asked to comment on the 2010 Tivoli Gardens massacre as a way of explaining the art of the state using violence to keep the political ruling class in power. Again, the art, and I have to emphasize that the art of using state violence to keep the political ruling class in power, the neo-colonial ruling class. And we want to take a look at what happened in Tivoli Gardens. But before I do that, let me also say that Jamaica has for decades had the distinction of having one of the highest rates of police extrajudicial killings in the world, one of the highest rates of police extrajudicial killings in the world. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and even the US State Department, the US State Department have written some damning reports on this practice. And they have all come to the conclusion that there is impunity for police extrajudicial killings. And of course, there's also a human rights group here in Jamaica, Jamaicans for Justice, that has collaborated with Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and so on. And they have also made their own analysis, investigation, and pointed out the ways in which police kill people and the methods of impunity. And we could, go into the methods of impunity, but let me just leave it at that level. The issue, though, is that despite the attempts or pretense at investigation, policemen carry out these killings. Who carry out these killings are rarely charged and rarely ever convicted, even though they have set up what they call a special body to investigate police extrajudicial killings. This body has not been very successful in terms of having policemen charged. And even if they do have them charged, very rarely are they convicted for one reason or another. You could say it is the ineffectiveness of the Director of Public Prosecutions. It could also be that the jury won't convict them, just like how in the United States you have white juries that will not convict white policemen because they belong to the same race, even though the evidence might be overwhelming against them. So you have a combination of things, of factors, which play out in terms of this impunity for police extrajudicial killings. I just say one quick little example. A policeman is caught on video, just as we are seeing in the United States, is caught on video circling a man on the street. He shoots him and kills him. And they take him to court. And when they take him to court, the policeman is exonerated because the person who took the video won't cooperate with the state, either in terms of giving evidence or to verify that this video wasn't doctored or something like that, which is really ridiculous because you have a dead body and you have a policeman with a gun. I'm sure the forensics and so on show that he fired the shot, but on a technical matter, the policeman is exonerated. So this kind of gives you an idea as to how different elements of this impunity system work. It is either one thing or another. In other words, despite attempts, as I said before, at investigation and so on, there is impunity. What this means then is that not only can an individual policeman make an on-the-spot decision to kill someone, but senior police officers can help to plan or approve a killing. The senior police officers also sanction the setting up of death squads to carry out these killings. Knowledge of what is going on goes right up to the Commissioner of Police, the Minister of National Security, and even as far as the Prime Minister. And the objective is clear. It is to put fear into the people and to normalize the use of state violence to solve social problems which arise from poverty and economic development. It also means that mass violence is an option for the state if it feels threatened. That is what happened in May 2010. The American government sent an extradition request for someone in Tivoli Gardens, described as a Don, and who was supposedly involved in the export of drugs into the United States and also the transshipment of guns. His name was Christopher Cole. The government declared a state of emergency and sent in hundreds of soldiers and police to capture him. As a matter of fact, it might have been thousands who were sent in to capture him. And yes, there was some token resistance to his capture, and but the security forces used this as a basis to carry out a massacre and to terrorize the residents of the area. Yes, there was some token resistance, but as I said before, it was token. At least 200 people were killed, many of them execution style. Mortar was dropped on civilian houses, and which is a war crime. There was torture and looting, and according to international law governing armed conflict, this was a crime against humanity. According to Jamaica law, the Terrorism Prevention Act was terrorism in action. And the Tivoli Committee, which I was involved in forming, argued that the matter should have been referred to the International Criminal Court, that the superior commanders had responsibility for what happened, and that they should be tried for crimes against humanity and for terrorism according to Jamaican law. We specifically identified the superior commanders as the police commissioner, the head of the army, and the prime minister. And as I explained before, there is impunity for extrajudicial killings. The matter was never referred to the International Criminal Court. There was a perfunctory commission of inquiry, which, as we predicted then, would provide a whitewash for the crimes committed by these superior commanders. The superior commanders knew what was happening. They did nothing to stop it, nor did they punish anyone. And that is how the matter is defined in international law. Now, let me just quickly summarize. Now, what is the meaning of this? It means that police extrajudicial killings continue in Jamaica. Impunity is the norm. More important, the superior commanders can continue to order police killings and get away with it. The Prime Minister himself admitted this recently. Soldiers and police were recently in Tivoli Gardens this week, and they abused residents as usual. Recently, a few days ago, in a rare case, 2 policemen were shot. But the police went back and executed a man they claim was responsible. There was sigh amongst those for the killing of the policeman, but they never have anything to say when the police kill a citizen. Finally, let me say that we are still waiting for a movement to develop, to exploit the present worldwide anti-imperialist demonstrations taking place. I don't have the time to explain why this hasn't happened in Jamaica, but the time is right. It can be exploited, it should be, and the need for a revolutionary response to the neo-colonial state violence in Jamaica could never be more needed. It will happen. Power to the people who become conscious. Let's encourage them. Let's continue to use the memory and the work of Walter Rodney as an inspiration for revolutionary struggle. And as for revolutionary struggle, let me say one last thing. The massacre which took place in Tivoli Gardens has the fingerprints of the imperialist powers clearly exposed. So this was indeed imperialism and its neo-colonial violence.
Thank you so much for that, Lloyd. That was really, really great. So now we have some time for a Q&A. Our comrade Amanda will be facilitating the questions. She's taking questions from the chat, and then the panelists can basically answer it from there. So Amanda, are you there?
Yeah, I am. First of all, thanks to everybody who's joined us today from around the world. We've got people from everywhere: Brazil, Guyana, Iraq, Zimbabwe, the Netherlands, the US, Colombia, Malaysia, and throughout the United Kingdom. So you're all very welcome. And you've left some wonderful comments so far. I'm going to start with a few comments, and then we've got a couple of questions for each panelist. First, a couple of comments from Khalid Badani, who's coming in from Sudan. And regarding Cecil's presentation, he said brilliant articulation of personal/political biography and neo-colonial violence weaved together. Thank you. Regarding Melinda's presentation, great points reminding us about the historical and legal origins of the Bretton Woods system that ties directly into the historical origins of neo-colonialism. From Leland de Cambra here in London, on this anniversary of Walter's assassination, we all need to be aware that his death certificate read, "Death by misadventure." This needs to be corrected. It's really important. Now to the questions. The first one comes from Errol Ganpatsing. I'm sorry if I butchered your name. For Melinda, does Ms. Janki think that China is any less exploitative? Do you want me to give all the questions for each person, or should we take them one by one?
Maybe one by one so that we don't inadvertently miss one. Do I think that China is any less exploitative? I think we need to look at the facts. Look at the arrangements that China has with developing countries now. Look at the contracts, look at the terms of those contracts, look at the debts that are being imposed on countries, look at the consequences of countries not being able to meet those debts. And I think the answer is clear, is that China is also involved, engaged in exploitation that has all the fingerprints of neo-colonial exploitation on it.
Great. Okay. The second question, also for Melinda, comes from Luann Jones. She said, thanks for this brilliant and concise analysis. Would love to know about the local and international resistance to the oil extraction in Guyana.
So within Guyana, there are people who, across a broad spectrum, are very, very unhappy about this deal. And if you pick up any one of the national newspapers on any day of any given week, you will see very trenchant and accurate criticism of the oil deal. Resistance in the sense of action. There's a court case. There's one case has already been filed, and I would expect that there would be others coming along in the future. That case is in the Court of Appeal, but it is very difficult at the moment to do any kind of mobilization because everyone has to stay home. So if you're thinking in terms of people actually going out on the streets, that's not going to happen. But in terms of local resistance, there is a great deal of anger in Guyana at the exploitative and abusive terms of this contract. And bear in mind, it's so bad. Even the IMF has said that this contract is favorable to the oil companies. Outside of, outside of Guyana, there is also a great deal of concern about the impact of this oil, both on the Guyanese people, but also because Guyana is a carbon bomb. There's over 13 billion barrels of oil and 32 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. That blows a hole in the Paris Agreement. And exploiting this with the help of the World Bank, of course, is a disaster for Guyana. It's a disaster regionally for the Caribbean. It's also a disaster globally. And it's putting at risk people everywhere. So once people realize what's going on, there is growing resistance and growing anger. But we do face a situation, and we have to be realistic, that most people had never heard of Guyana until quite recently. So we also have to take that into account.
Thank you. And there was a comment left by a colleague of Melinda's, just saying that if you're interested more in terms of the campaign that Melinda just referenced, Google Crowd Justice, a fair deal for Guyana for more information. Leland DeCambra also has a question for Melinda. Why was ESSO not fined for failing to re-inject the gas as they're supposed to do? Thanks.
Good question. First of all, I think the Environmental Protection Agency is being asked to do a job that is maybe impossible. They don't have the equipment, they don't have the people, they don't have the boats, they don't have the drones, they don't have resources to do what they need to do. Secondly, they will need to go to court in order to get a conviction, and that's going to take some time. I would urge people, though, to put pressure on the EPA to enforce the Environmental Protection Act and to enforce the environmental permit. It's not enough to say, well, the law is there and the EPA should do this. EPA have a huge amount to do, as I said, without the resources. So there needs to be public pressure which says that it is unacceptable to be flaring the gas. It is unacceptable not to be re-injecting. It is unacceptable to be treating Guyanese in this way. It is unacceptable, for example, to allow any oil company to dump 4,000 barrels of sewage into the ocean. So what really needs to happen is pressure from citizens, from activists, from people who care about the environment, from people who care about what is happening to the Guyanese people, to put pressure to implement the law, to put pressure to enforce it.
Thank you. We have a question for, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. We have a question for from Frederick Collins for Mr. Gutzmore. Is there no benefit to third world countries from capitalist investment? What then is the future of Kagame's Rwanda, the star of Africa, currently?
The long and the short of it, and Walter Rodney is clear about this, is that there really is no benefit from embracing this mechanism of foreign capitalist direct investment. And there is a literature, a developing literature, which exposes the claims of a miracle, the claims of an economic miracle under Kagame in the country just mentioned. And people need to spend time looking at what is objectively happening. The alleged miracle there is a myth, and that is the long and short of it. So to repeat, I advise people to read and reread Walter, to listen to the presentation that our sister just made about how this particular deal in Guyana operates. It's worse than usual, but even the much better ones are fundamentally defective in relation to the rip-off of resources from our countries of origin into places like the US and the UK and Germany and so on. So there is no good reason to be joyful about what's happening under Kagame, and absolutely no reason to embrace foreign direct capitalist investment.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, we have another question from Errol, this time for Lloyd. He says, Lloyd, would not the gross underdevelopment of poor countries be most effectively countered by our people's diasporas tangibly incentivized to come home to develop our countries rather than the rich ones?
You know, capitalism is capitalism, whether the capital is coming from the diaspora or it's locally generated capital, or as we've been talking about, foreign direct investment. You know, the capitalist system is based on the exploitation of labor. As was being said before, there are some types of development which benefit the people, some which destroy the environment. And so we have to look at a planned economy. You know, let me put it that way. What we really need in the world today is a planned economy, so that capital just doesn't come in for the sake of coming in. It comes in because when it comes in, it contributes to the environment, it contributes to the social needs. It's not a waste of resources. and it makes sense. So we need a planned economy at the local level and the international level. So this discussion about whether it's foreign direct investment or whatever, ultimately, we have to make a decision as to what benefits us. For example, China comes in and China builds highways in Jamaica, spending billions of dollars, and then the people get into debt because we have to pay back that money. But do we really need these super highways that they're building? You know, do we really need it? So those are the questions. So if the diaspora has capital and wants to come in and participate, I hope they're not coming to build highways, and I hope they're not coming to exploit labor as everybody else does, but they are contributing to the social needs and the environment and a practical environmental system, etc. So capital is capital, whether it's whether it's diaspora, it's local, or it's from the imperialist country.
Thank you. Okay, we do have another question, this time from Ruben Martin for Melinda. He says, realistically, what time frame does Guyana have to take hold of its resources and redistribute power before climate change and globalization makes it futile? Melinda? You're muted.
Yes, thank you very much. Guyana doesn't have a great deal of time, and in fact, neither does the rest of the world. We are already locked into very dangerous global warming. There is no carbon budget. So when we talk about Guyana exploiting its resources, that's actually a non-starter. The fossil fuel sector is going through a slow motion collapse. There are trillions of dollars of stranded fossil fuel assets. There is a carbon bubble in the global economy. And when that bursts, there will be huge consequences for the rich countries as well as the developing countries. So now is the time to move as fast as possible away from fossil fuels and to look at what really are the assets. Article 36 of the Guyana Constitution contains a statement of natural capital. And what Guyana needs to do is to put a value on that natural capital and ensure that there is a physical, material base of biodiversity, clean air, clean water, that is actually the basis of the economy, and move forward on using that, not taking the fossil fuels out of the ground. 2 miles below the ocean bed, by the way, so this is ultra deep sea mining, and it is very dangerous. Leaving it where it is and looking at how Guyana can make use of the real natural resources that it has without endangering the lives of the people in Guyana and the lives of people elsewhere.
Okay, thank you so much to the panelists, and again to people on the live chat for sending those wonderful questions. And also sending in very appreciative comments for all of your responses. We're going to take a break now. We'll reconvene at 3:40. It's 3:22 my time locally. We are going to, for those who do want to sit in front of their computer screens during the break, we're going to play a segment from a film made by the very Luann Jones, who asked a question a few minutes ago. It's a segment featuring footage of Dr. Walter Rodney called In the Sky's Wild Noise. We'll see you at 3:40.
Walter, but all this long intro, that's his funeral, I think. But all this long intro. I was supposed to find some.
Can you see it? I can't do nothing about it because it will just show.
Platform can tell you that the remedy in Guyana is that a new set of people must take over from the old set of people, and we will run the system better. That is no solution to the problems of Guyana. The problem is much more fundamental than that. We are saying that working class people will get just only when they take the initiative, when they mold themselves. Nobody else can give it as a gift. Someone who comes claiming to be a liberator is either deluding himself or he's trying to delude the people. He either doesn't understand the process of real life or he is trying to suggest that you do not understand it. And so long as we suffer from a great concept of politics as being leadership, we are going to be in a lot of trouble.
In our society at the present time, some specific rights which had been won through struggle by the people in the colonial period are now in the process of being eroded. One takes the most obvious, the electoral process. In Guyana, it is now, I think, widely known inside the country and outside of the country that first of all, the Americans intervened along with the British to abort the democratic process from 1953 onwards. And secondly, that once the present government got into power, it extended the scale of electoral fraud so that we cannot claim at the present time to be a politically enfranchised people. We cannot claim to have chosen our own national government. And that is one level. Below that level, you find that there is reproduced in every facet of the national life the same anti-democratic tendencies. So that there are no local government elections, for instance. They have local government elections are postponed every time they become due with ease, with no concern whatsoever, with no reaction. There are no elections taking place within certain trade unions, where workers at that basic level should be choosing their representatives to deal with their material interests. And once that anti-democratic principle is established, we see them step by step we move backwards. And I say backwards very deliberately. These were not rights or privileges which were handed to us by the British. The right to have your union and to have a democratic union was won through struggle in this very century. The right to have democratic elections was won only in the late 1940s and in 1963 when there was universal adult suffrage. So that these recently conquered rights are now in the process of being withheld, eroded, dissipated in one form or fashion. In the early years of independence, or the last years of colonialism, we had certain illusions that having inherited the formal modes of political procedure from the British, that of necessity we would not follow the path that had been followed by other Latin American territories or by countries such as Haiti, Andre the Valley, and the Dominican Republic and Cuba and the like. And as people begin to recognize that many of these authoritarian traits and repressive institutions can and are emerging in our society, I feel that there is a growing awareness of the need to attempt to combat this repression. One of the significant areas in which repression is taking place is the whole area of the media, the newspapers and the radio. We find that since the government has taken over the papers, it has ostensibly nationalized these newspapers, meaning in the interest of the nation, but in practice it is specifically in the interest of the ruling party. As the Prime Minister of this country himself once cynically remarked, he says, the government never tells the newspapers what to print, they simply tell them what not to print. And then they go beyond that. They're not prepared to allow competing centers of information so that they utilize illegal machinery to crush things like the Mirror, the People's Progressive Party's newspaper, the Day Clean, which is a news sheet printed by the Working People's Alliance. They had made it impossible for a political organization to print a newspaper. That organization then resorted to mimeographing a sheet, but the government considered it absolutely essential to continue to persecute, to go to the level of seizing typewriters, to make it impossible for people to type and produce a mimeograph sheet. The point is that elements that clearly purport to be anti-socialist are not pursued in the society with the same vigor. It indicates the direction of the attack that is being borne by the government. It's not against reactionary elements, it's not against imperialist elements, it's really against anti-imperialist and progressive forces.
Anybody hearing me? What's happening? We live on air? Yes.
Hi, sorry, slight miscommunication. I'm going to send it back to Jello. I can find him.
Back to you, Brother Cecil.
Okay. I'm to go.
Yes,
Hello.
Sir. Yes, sir.
Welcome back to you of our audience, I repeat, wherever you are, virtually or geographically. It is good that we're able to continue now. And we have our second panel, which will continue to address the issues of neo-colonial violence in the world in which we live, bearing in mind that imperialism is also violent in its central places, in the belly of the beast, as George Jackson once put it. Now, we're going to hear first from our brother Kevin, who introduced himself earlier. So I won't reintroduce him. I will just ask him to go into his presentation, which looks at political violence in Kenya's transition to neocolonialism. Kevin.
Thank you, Cecil. So I'll start off my presentation now.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we did say that the break would last until 3:40. We've still got 6 minutes. Should we not wait? Or
I'm happy to wait, providing that hasn't gone out already.
Well, it has, but it's a live stream. Is it okay if we restart with Cecil in about 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Is it okay? Okay.
I'm happy to wait and to repeat.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you to both.
While you're listening, Amanda.
Yes.
I can't pretend to have the bios to introduce the people in this panel.
They're
Can I be assisted in any way?
I could, if you like. They're in the full.
Can they be put up for each person? It may be a bit of an ask.
It would be. Do you want to read them out, or do you want?
No, I'm happy to read them out.
Okay.
If yeah.
I'll put them in the chat.
If it's visually there, it will be enough.
Okay. It's not going to be up on the screen. It'll only be available for you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right. So here we go.
She's sending you an email. She sent you an email to get what she said, or she can put it up on that screen.
Amanda.
Hi.
Did you say that you're going to put up the bio information, or you're going to send it to me by email, or how?
It's in the chat. So if you go down to the chat button and just bring it up, it's all there.
Where's the chat, Claire? Oh yes, that one. Okay, got it.
Does that work? Cool.
Yes.
That's great.
Am I supposed to be able to see that?
Can't see it.
Do you want me to email it to you? Or actually,
it may be easier for me to handle. I apologize for this.
Sorry. What would you prefer?
If you could send it to me by email, because I could access it immediately and be looking at it.
Okay, right away.
Also, my intro on that list.
I've just sent the entire program again, okay?
All right. Final version of program.
Got it. So you can see it.
Yes, I think I have it
Okay.
I still won't try to reintroduce Kevin.
That's okay.
I gotta rely on what he previously said. But the others I appear to have, yes.
That's great. I'm going to mute myself now. I'm going to mute myself now. So we've got about a minute, okay?
Okay.
Thanks.
Go now.
I think it's time to start now.
Welcome again, brothers, sisters, comrades. I repeat, from wherever you're located, either globally, virtually, or actually. It is good to have you with us, and we're going to continue our program with a presentation from our brother Kevin, who chaired the last session, who introduced himself, who spoke to you at some length, and I won't reintroduce him. I'll just invite brother Kevin Okoth to make his presentation, which is on political violence in Kenya in the moment of the transition to neo-colonialism. Kevin.
Thank you, Cecil. So as we've kind of seen recently, the momentum from the Black Lives Matter protests has spread quite rapidly across the world. We're seeing a lot of protests in London here as well at the moment. Unfortunately, as I'm hearing, there's a very vicious far-right response at the moment to the protests that are happening in central London right now. But there's been a lot of protests kind of also in the global south about kind of police violence that have split off from the banner of Black Lives Matter. For instance, in Nairobi, there was several protests kind of around the US embassy, and there was some protests using the same language as the Black Lives Matter movement, which might not necessarily always be the right language to address what's going on in Kenya. But there's been much bigger demonstrations that have kind of gotten, I think, a lot of media attention because of kind of the Black Lives Matter protests, such as a bigger demonstration in the Mathare slum in Nairobi earlier this week in response to two police killings, specifically that of 51-year-old James Mureithi and 13-year-old Yasin Moyo. He was shot, the 13-year-old boy was shot playing on his balcony for breaking the COVID-19 curfew. So he was playing on his balcony after curfew. Since the COVID-19 lockdown, so they've had a dusk to dawn curfew in Nairobi. And that was imposed obviously to spread restrict the spread of COVID-19. But as a police watchdog has pointed out, there's at least 15 people who have been killed by police officers since the dusk to dawn curfew has been imposed. And so there's a big contradiction there between people losing their lives and livelihoods while supposedly being protected from this vicious virus. But I think it has something to do with Kenya's outward presentation of its ability to kind of enforce a lockdown and show that it's capable of managing the virus. But I think on a positive note, there's now a lot of media attention on kind of those conversations that are happening and what police violence is in Kenya and the long legacy of police violence in Kenya. So just to kind of give a picture of how prevalent it is, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation report that was from 2013, it was a report that outlined injustices and abuses that occurred in Kenya between December 1963, so around the moment of independence, and the end of post-election violence in 2008, where they collected over 40,000 statements. I think that's one of the largest number of documents are collected by any Truth Commission to date. And what it found is that all three post-colonial, or we would call neo-colonial regimes up to that point, had been responsible for gross human rights violations. So the governments of Jomo Kenyatta, Daniel Arap Moi, and Mwai Kibaki. A second finding is that security forces had been the main perpetrators of massacres, enforced disappearances, torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence. But I think there's also a specific thing that I'd like to talk about today that's pointed out in that report is another form specifically of neo-colonial violence, which is the legacy of political assassinations in Kenya. So the report also found that the Jomo Kenyatta regime, which is the first post-independence government, was responsible for the largest number of political assassinations out of the different post-colonial governments, whereas repression of dissent reached its apex under Daniel Arap Moi, which is the successor to Jomo Kenyatta. There's several high-profile assassinations that kind of set in motion a series of political assassinations, beginning with that of Pio Gama Pinto in 1965, another MP, Tom Mboya, in 1969, and another MP, J.M. Kariuki, in 1975. So now in kind of like, these kind of illustrate that political killings have become bureaucratized and legitimized as like an effective political tool in Kenyan politics. So, you know, for example, we have some pointers as to why these people were killed. For J.M. Kariuki, the case was he was a socialist member of parliament, an assistant minister. He was Kenyatta's former secretary, but the ruling elite were relatively uneasy with kind of his growing influence. And he was a fierce critic of the Kenyatta regime and had close ties to the masses, disagreed with the ruling government on inequality, for instance, land distribution, government corruption, and youth unemployment. And in 1973, in a response to Kenyatta praising the country's achievements, he said, Kenya has become a nation of 10 millionaires and 10 million beggars. But there's another political assassination that I'd like to talk a little bit more about, is that of Pio Gama Pinto, which has been described as post-independence Kenya's first political assassination. He was killed in February 1965, shot in his car outside of his Nairobi home with his daughter in the passenger seat. Pio Pinto was a Goan Kenyan socialist MP and a member of the KANU party, but the opposing wing to Kenyatta. And I think the kind of that moment when he got killed can give us a lot of insight into kind of neo-colonial violence and what the purpose of it is, and kind of the political dynamics by which neo-colonial rule is enforced. So, you know, how can we understand these political assassinations? Are they merely the result of a corrupt elite trying desperately to hold on to power? And the answer is, of course, no. These political assassinations in Kenya must be considered within the framework of neo-colonialism. As Andy has pointed out, who we'll be hearing from later, today's imperialism does not, for the most part, rule directly through colonial means, but indirectly through an alliance with national elites who've thrown their lot into a voluntary self-enriching pact with the global system. So it's a process also that has its roots in the early days of independence. So oftentimes this is enforced both military or elite corruption is a function of imperialism's control over African nations, which is then enforced both militarily through interventions, counterinsurgency measures, and assassinations, or economically enforced by financial and trade institutions such as the World Bank. We've heard about that earlier, the IMF or NGOs. And the aim is to ensure that imperialist corporations continue to drain wealth and that the right leaders are empowered to make that happen. And I think that's how we can understand, as Issa Shivji has pointed out, that there were over 60 successful coups in Africa between 1956 and 1985, and mostly orchestrated with the help of the US and also the CIA with help from local agents. So about Kenya specifically, I think Rodney's essay on class contradictions in Tanzania, it's a talk that he delivered in 1975, is quite instructive here to show what's at stake in the Kenyan case. So what Rodney says is that in Kenya, there was a different line because the Kenyans always had one advantage from their class perspective. Kenya was and still is a sub-imperialist center in East Africa. It is the point of entry for foreign capital into the whole of East African community, not just into Kenya alone. Consequently, the opportunities for pickings, if you like, were always higher in Kenya. So this kind of shows a little bit of what's at stake in the Kenyan case compared to, for instance, other East African countries such as Tanzania or Uganda. So what happened around independence is we saw a big shift in the conversation about the post-independence, first post-independence presidents, Jomo Kenyatta. Around like 1963, you see a shift in kind of the way international and British media are covering Kenyatta. Before it was always, he was a Soviet-trained leader of the Mau Mau resistance. But now kind of the narrative was more that he was a wise anti-communist nationalist. And I think this is also the result of a famous speech that he delivered in Nakuru in 1963, which assured white settlers that the safety of their farms and property in Kenya, which then also led to sustained support from the white settlers. But this also meant that he had to betray basically the Mau Mau movement, which has been responsible for Kenyan independence. It was a movement of peasants, working class, landless squatters, urban poor, but also specifically a movement by landless squatters. And so Jomo Kenyatta basically had to betray that movement in order to gain legitimacy from the British government. But there were also a number of necessary political changes that were put in place. So for Kenyatta to be worthwhile investment for the British, the first post-independence government had to be resolutely pro-imperialist. So he had to sell these pro-imperialist positions as authentically African and therefore the most appropriate for the post-independence context. So then there was much of a kind of British engineered plan to bring another moderate party, the KADU, founded by Daniel Arap Moi and financed through the City of London, into KANU, just to ensure that those interests were represented in the first post-independence government. So then we had, at that moment, there's two factions in KANU. So there's one faction that's kind of moderate nationalists that kind of embrace continuity and not a total break with the past. That's around Kenyatta and Tom Mboya, who was also later assassinated. And then we have another faction, which is that around Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and Pio Pinto, which really pushed for a total break with the colonial system. And they also set the tone for KANU's first manifesto. So the British intelligence services had already been weary about Jaramogi Oginga Odinga since a famous speech that he gave endorsing Kenyatta early on. But he'd also traveled a lot to the German Democratic Republic, the Soviet Union, and China, and had kind of received funds for KANU from the socialist countries. So that's why MI6 was rather concerned about his communist leanings and wanted to make sure that faction got sidelined at independence. On the moderate or conservative wing, we then had moderates such as Daniel Arap Moi, and also from 1957 onwards, we had Tom Mboya, who was receiving financial support from the United States through the trade union movement. So what kind of the British sought to do was British and American interests sought to do was basically to undermine the left-wing power base in KANU by also sidelining the radicals, undermining their influence in the trade unions through the promotion of Mboya, for instance, and kind of through the articulation of a very rigid anti-communist stance. This also resulted in Odinga being arrested and detained for 2 years, and obviously Pio Pinto murdered in 1965. So a lot of the debate, I think, that I'd like to still talk about now at the end is the debate around the sessional paper number 10, which was the sessional paper number 10 on African socialism and its implications for planning in Kenya, which was kind of an economic proposal that was tabled as to basically define Kenya's post-independence economic program. But as Feroz Manji has pointed out, the authorship that was usually attributed to Tom Mboya and Mwai Kibaki, who would also go on to be a president, but that there's a key architect in that, and that was a political economist called Edgar O. Edwards, who basically made that proposal. And he was under the instructions of the US Embassy to assist the Ministry of Planning. So the purpose of that paper specifically, despite its name, was to offer something that sounded like, or to use the word socialism, just to basically pay lip service to the discourse or Pan-African discourse that was happening at the time amongst, the governments of Tanzania or Ghana, and just basically pay lip service to that. But while clearly defining what you could only call Kenya's path towards a subservient capitalism. And I think this paper specifically it was designed to basically end the debate around capitalism, imperialism, neo-colonialism, and kind of erase those terms from the political vocabulary of the mass of people. And I think the Truth and Justice Reconciliation Report also shows this very clearly. It says that Kenyatta made it clear in his introduction that the intent was not to stimulate discussions on Kenya's economic policy, but to end it. So following the sessional paper 10 and following that being tabled, the faction around Odinga and Pio Pinto were preparing a competing paper that would reject the government proposal and push a socialist proposal. and would also call for a vote of no confidence in Jomo Kenyatta. And this is clearly, we can kind of see how this has been engineered, and that's why Pio Pinto basically had to be eliminated. We can also see the threat of kind of the socialist politicians then at that time through a testimony from the last colonial governor of Kenya, Malcolm MacDonald, who on Pinto said, a dedicated communist and the principal brain behind the whole secret organization of Mr. Odinga's movement. So it was kind of a dangerous point for the British, and their interests would definitely seem to be threatened. So that facilitated, or basically because of that, they organized the assassination of Pio Pinto. Even when he was assassinated, they were also setting up the institution, an institution that had already been set up a little bit earlier called the Lumumba Institute, which is named after another victim of neo-colonial violence, who we might hear about later on as well. And the institute was set up with help from socialist countries to train Kanu cadres, but was shut down and made illegal shortly after Pinto's death. So Pinto and Odinga and a Maasai leader called John Keane had been planning to set up a communist party of Kenya. And the Lumumba Institute was to be the first kind of real step in that direction. But then obviously it was shut down after Pio Pinto's murder. So what we can then see at the end of this process of kind of the transition from colonialism to neo-colonialism, I think a 1978 British intelligence report is really, really instructive here. It kind of outlines how satisfied the British were with the overall relationship that Kenyatta basically facilitated between Britain and Kenya. And I think there's a quote there that says, "They developed a relationship which has been mutually beneficial to his own and British interests." And I think that kind of shows how successfully, even through that process, the ideological battles had been erased, and kind of neo-colonialism was able basically to triumph in that context. And I think we see a lot of the results of kind of that transition process in how kind of over the last decades, politics have been spoken about in Kenya, and that kind of how that vocabulary of socialism, communism, anti-imperialism, neo-colonialism has kind of gotten lost over time. But that we have to remember that that was a concerted effort to kind of remove that political vocabulary and to take away the institutions that would enable people to learn to speak in that way and to organize in that way as well. So I'd like to end my presentation there, but if there's any further questions, I'm happy to chat about them later on.
Thank you very much, Comrade Brother Kevin. It's exploration of the Kenya situation historically. We now move to a presentation which is a joint effort by brothers and sisters and comrades who are part of the campaign in Bolivia. And there are three persons who we will hear from or should hear from. Abigail Torres, who is a woman of Aymara origins, who graduated in political science and public administration from the University of San Andres, and is a member of an activist collective in La Paz. We're also going to hear from Carlos Suri, who is a student of communication engineering, and who also practices theater, dance, music, street art, and above all is a political activist for social change and a member of another ongoing cultural collective. And the third member is Jose Sagaz, who also is Aymara of Aymara origin and is a teacher and a member of the Bolivia Solidarity Campaign and a political activist for social justice. I hope they're immediately available to do this for us.
Okay, hello everybody. Okay. In Bolivia, we have been led to believe that developed countries have the absolute truth, and underdeveloped countries do not. They think that the colonizers come to civilize our community. However, our community already had their own political structure, the rotation of position of power, the border economy, where the community economy exists instead of individualistic. Education and science was also developed, and the evidence of that are the ruins of Tiwanaku. We can say that to this day, community teach and practice their philosophy, their spirit with nature. Chachawarmi, what does it mean? It's complementary and equality with men and women. However, so it was the colonization of our educational system. Today, it is classist, religious, and elitist, thus creating a small privileged area. These these elites, I'm sorry, or people who identified with them, feel empowered by humiliating people of the indigenous community by shouting at them ignorant Indians. This was also the main cause of the coup in Bolivia, because we still have an elitist education that is sold as a merchandise for those privileged families who resent an Indian, sorry, an indigenous of the community to govern the country. So that's all.
Okay, thank you. I will get in now. Thanks to all. Yeah, English is not our first language, so bear with us. Yeah, well, one of the reasons why the Spaniards didn't make us disappear like they did in other parts of Latin America, in Cuba there is no indigenous people, or very few, for example, in Venezuela and Colombia. One of the reasons why they didn't make us disappear was because we have a huge mountain full of silver, Cerro de Potosí, and they couldn't bring slaves from Africa because it was too high. It was above 4,000 meters sea level. So they have to use us, and they have to make us to work. So they use the social structure to extract the minerals from the cerro, the mountain of Potosí. And that helped us to maintain our traditions, our culture, and that's one of the reasons why we're still here now. We are resisting, we're keeping our own language, we're keeping our own traditions and our own system of organization between ourselves. When Bolivia as a country was created, when they got independence from Spain, we, the indigenous, were worse treated. It was our situation, it was bad with the Spaniards. When we got independence, it was even worse. The neo-colonizers, the new elite that the colonizers created in Bolivia, used to sell land with people included, with us included in the land, like if we were animals. But in 1952, we made a revolution. Before Cuba, peasants and miners, we united and we smashed the state. We defeat the army and the police. And some middle classes, Marxists, copy the transitional program by Leon Trotsky. They adapted to the Bolivian reality and they call it the thesis of Pulacayo. All that was brilliant, but these revolutionary middle classes, white middle classes, didn't have the courage to take power. So they had, after we smashed the state, the workers, the peasants, and the miners, they couldn't take power because they didn't feel that they could govern, rule ourselves. So they handed to Victor Paz Estensoro, which was doctor, a lawyer. And from 1952 to 2003, the same ruling class ruled us. The same ruling class was sometimes with elections, sometimes with coup d'etats, same people in power. Until 2005, where Evo Morales came to power, an Aymara, an indigenous, and he won the presidential elections by landslide. At the time, the geopolitical situation in South America was in favor of socialist ideas. It was Néstor Kirchner in Argentina, Hugo Chávez in Venezuela, Ignacio Lula da Silva in Brazil, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. But still, after Evo Morales got in power, they attempt a coup d'etat in 2008 to Evo Morales. But because we were ready, we organized and we managed to defeat that coup d'etat. I think I'm running out of time. Well, Evo Morales wrote a new constitution recognizing 36 nationalities. It abolished illiteracy. It reduced extreme poverty by 35%. It grew economically 4% the GDP for the last consecutive 6 years. He stopped inflation, invested in our own industries. Thousands of students sent abroad with grants to study around the world. But still, there was a coup d'etat 6 months ago, and still now we can see the racists walking on the streets, fascists beating up indigenous people. And as Dr. Walter Rodney says, neo-colonialism, right now we thought we were managed to kick it out from our country, but no, we're still in the middle of it. It's even worse. It's like in the 60s. I'm just gonna pass for the last minute to Abigail, to last words.
Okay. Rodney says colonialism had only hand, it was a one-armed bandit. The Bolivian elite has managed to consolidate a coup d'etat in Bolivia through racial violence using shock troops such as the Cochala Youth Resistance, who directed attacks against peasant and indigenous peoples. The military and police repressed mobilized sectors who opposed the military police coup and proceeded towards the destruction and burning of the Huipala, indigenous people's flag symbol. The process of change initiated by the government of Evo Morales started decolonizing the country, moving away from the ideology of Bolivian elites who denied their indigenous origin and emphasized their European Western looks. Moreover, the highly racial and fascistic violence with which the elite interrupted this decolonization process made it evident that their interests are nothing more than a bandit supported by blinded, violent sector of the Bolivian middle class. Thank you.
That presentation. It's really good to be hearing from South America and from the way in which imperialism is impacting the original peoples of that continent. We now go to a further presentation. Our presenter is very much here, Dr. Jude Lal Fernando, who is director of the Center for Post-Conflict Justice in Trinity College, Dublin. He's originally from Sri Lanka and he lives in exile in Ireland. He's coordinator of the People's Tribunal on Sri Lanka. And we just need to know, although he might very well tell us, that a terrible massacre happened there and that the international community has largely ignored it because as part of the way in which counterterrorism was set up, the Sri Lankan government was central to that, and it organized itself in such a way as to be able to carry out the massacre behind counterterrorism, international counterterrorism provision. Dr. Fernando, please speak.
Thank you, Cecil. Thank you very much. To start with, my topic is, as you might have seen, forced unity in Sri Lanka and forced division of Ireland. Neo-colonial violence, genocide, and peace processes. Now, it is for the sake of a unitary state structure, which I call the forced unity of Sri Lanka, which the British Empire created, that the massacre that Cecil mentioned happened between 2007 and 2009. It is a genocide. That is the word. That is why the word genocide is used in the title. And neo-colonial violence takes place in the form of a genocide. What is important here is to see that what happened in Sri Lanka is not a single state action due to the brutality of a particular security force of a country, but because of its historical construction as a strategic neo-colonial state, the massacre happened. Secondly, forced division of Ireland. Ireland is a divided country. This division is not simply territorial, it is also the division of the working classes. So that the British imperialism can continue to work in the island of Ireland. And neo-colonial violence in Ireland today operates through the institutionalized division of the country in the name of a so-called liberal peace, which had neoliberal structural changes as a peace dividend, which excludes the working classes, which makes them homeless, which makes thousands of children to wait in the hospital appointment queues for years and years without being able to have a proper treatment. So in one end of the globe, Neo-colonial violence operates in the form of a genocide of the Tamils. On the other end of the globe, it unfolds in the form of a liberal peace where neoliberal structural changes have taken place, excluding a vast number of people. Now, this is the background. Let me come to Walter Rodney. Now, in his article on Tanzania, he very astutely focuses on the ways in which class formation are configured matter in national liberation struggles. Now, in the case of Tanzania, he finds that there was, even though there was a division between the petty bourgeoisie, the elite, and the working classes and the peasants of Tanzania, the petty bourgeoisie were excluded in the post-independent regime by the international capital, so that they made an alliance with the emerging peasant working class movement that demanded a different kind of a social system, a different kind of an economic system. The elite in Tanzania didn't have a very deep relationship with land ownership. Therefore, the Tanzanian form of socialism we talk about and Rodney talks about could be achieved as a result of this alliance that the different classes could make under particular material conditions, in particular because of the exclusion by the international capital of certain classes in Tanzania. Even though the petty bourgeoisie were looking up to that capital coming into the country. And I quote, the Arusha Declaration, which is a progressive declaration, is a starting point of modern Tanzania development. This was a response to internal crisis, a response to the stagnation of the neo-colonial economy in Tanzania. And it really marked the failure of the hopes of the petty bourgeoisie, that international capital would have entered their situation to strengthen the class in a particular kind of way. The petty bourgeoisie had assumed that after independence, if they took the attitude of welcoming foreign capital and welcoming foreign aid, international foreign capital would be forthcoming. This was really the assumption. They imagined that there was some process of growth within the neo-colonial picture, within the post-colonial imperialist framework, which would allow them to develop a class. But this was not, in fact, forthcoming. But he also concludes in that article, giving us some kind of a future analysis to the ways in which that we can combine national liberation struggles and socialism, how the Tanzanian brand of socialism failed due to the re-emergence of those class divisions within that country, where certain sectors got again aligned with the international capital, and then the post-colonial violence got restarted, which was contained but restarted. Now, the second point is with regard to the role of the petty bourgeoisie. It is interesting to hear what he says. He says that we should not look at the petty bourgeoisie always in a derogatory way, because some of us can be happy. You know? Walter Rodney says that we can do something positive. He considers petty bourgeoisie not as a, I quote, a decadent stereotype, but as a stratum with various possibilities. And he concludes that there can be a revolutionary petty bourgeoisie who can play a progressive intellectual role with the working classes and the peasants. Now, looking at this theoretical analysis, let me come back to Sri Lanka and Ireland. Now, in the case of Ireland, we could see, particularly in the Easter Uprising in 1916, there was a clear goal against British imperialism and to achieve national freedom or liberation. Now, in that, those leaders who emerged from working class backgrounds, like James Connolly, stood for an inseparable link between socialism and national liberation struggle. For that, he upheld the unity of both the Catholic and the Protestant working classes. But on the other hand, unlike Tanzania, there were already contradictions that had been created by the British imperial system in Ireland by forming a bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie harnessed their capitalist interests with the nationalist feelings of the working classes and the peasants in Ireland. Even though the uprising and what happened subsequently was strong enough to combine the socialist project of James Connolly and the national liberation struggle, the bourgeoisie in a way led or facilitated to the division of Ireland. Division of Ireland, as I said, is not only a division of territories, it is also a division of the working classes. Now that is with regard to Ireland. Now, on the other hand, it is interesting to see how, let me quote James Connolly here. How did James Connolly envisage a common struggle between the Irish Catholics and the Protestants? Now, he looked at the Catholics as those who have been dispossessed by force and looked at the Protestant working classes as a group that has been dispossessed by fraud, by deception, by those in London. Now, interestingly, there is an ideological factor. Those who have been dispossessed by force also believe ideologically that they are part of the British Empire. We, the royals, we are the chosen ones, as opposed to the wretched of the earth. So there is a racial element there. And Rodney very clearly says that the ethnic differences, religious differences, would not in themselves, as an essentialist categories, create political antagonisms. But under certain political conditions, the ideological component is being formed by dividing the oppressed working, exploited, and later oppressed working classes. Now, therefore, you could see in the island of Ireland a group that is not only deceived by fraud, but also believes ideologically, even though they are dispossessed, that they socially and religiously are superior to the Irish. Now, let me go to Sri Lanka. Now, why did the British do that? In fact, Ireland, as we know, is the first colony of the British Empire and the first experiment of agrarian capital. And in the face of Spanish and the French emergence, Ireland was seen as a strategic location. And in that sense, the British created a particular mindset amongst the Protestants, even though they were also exploited, as James Connolly clearly said, in his vision of Ireland. They believed that they have to own Ireland. Now, because of the Irish national republican struggle, the whole island could not be used as a strategic location. So you find on the one hand the class analysis here. On the other hand, you find the ideological factor where race, ethnicity, and religion are used. And then you find, connected to that, imperialism's strategic moves. And let me immediately, very quickly go to Sri Lanka, which is closer to my heart. From the very moment the British landed in the island of Lanka, they didn't see it as a land filled with milk and honey, or a land that has a history of 2000 years of original form of Buddhism. They simply saw it as the finest place where they have a harbor to control India. And William Pitt in 1902 says, this is the most valuable island on earth. Why? Because India was the jewel of the crown for the British, for the Industrial Revolution. In order to hold on to India, British needed a strategic location, and Sri Lanka provides that strategic usability, where it has got one of the most important harbors in the Tamil areas, which is called Trincomalee, which is the third or the fourth natural harbor in the world, which is about 1,000 meters deep. Let me immediately come to the class connection. Now, the Sinhalese and the Tamils both fought the British and the Portuguese and the Dutch before that. And they fought in there are two different regions. There were different kingdoms, to cut short the story. But the British amalgamated the entire island into one single unitary political structure. Because to use the strategic place of this island, the country should have one single political structure. If you have two political structures, strategically, it is going to be highly unstable. So by doing that, the British created a mindset amongst the Sinhalese so that they believe that the entire island belongs to them. Now, who were the Sinhalese in the colonial economy? In the colonial economy, the most of the Sinhalese still were the peasants. The Tamils too were the farmers and the peasants. And the Sinhala peasants had enough land. When the British started plantation system, like here in Ireland, in the province of Ulster, they did not really bring the British planters there to work like they were transported here to Ireland. They did not capture land that was owned by the native Irish Catholics, but they got the land that was there, that was unused. And then the most dispossessed people who had lost their land in India due to English plantations in India, they were brought by ships to work in the plantations, which means the Sinhala people had land. And the first group that was exploited were the plantation workers, who were Tamils in the Central Hills. Very quickly, what happened later on was the Sinhala elite were invited by the British to join the plantations that formed a single bourgeoisie. Now, as in the case of Tanzania, the elite were not disconnected to land in this sense. The singular elite were deeply connected to land. And they were not only deeply connected to land, they were a dependent bourgeoisie, not an independent bourgeoisie, relatively speaking. It's a contradiction in terms, because India relatively had some kind of an independent capitalist class who could develop a welfare state under Nehru and others. But Sri Lankan elite were totally dependent. So we call it, a Tamil scholar, Sadi, in his book titled Dependent Capitalism, explains this. Now, then we find later on the merchant class emerging. The merchant class, in a way, embraced the mentality that the British created. And then they were the ones who became the emerging nationalist, anti-colonial nationalist vanguard in that country. That was not against the British. That was against the Muslims and the Tamils in the country and the plantation workers. So you could see, you don't find a strong working class. Instead, you find a petty bourgeoisie merchant class and an elite who have been groomed like the loyalists in Ireland unto the image and likeness of the colonial master, who loves the colonial master but hates the Tamil, hates the Muslim. Let me quote the wordings of the pioneer of the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism in 1915. I quote, "What the German is to the British, that the Mohammedan is to the Sinhalese. He is an alien to the Sinhalese by religion, race, and language. He traces his origin to Arabia, while the Sinhalese traces his origin to India and to Aryan sources. To the Sinhalese, without Buddhism, death is preferable. The British officials may shoot, hang, quarter, imprison, or do anything to the Sinhalese, but there will always be bad blood between the Moors and the Sinhalese. But my loyalty to the British throne is as solid as a rock, and I have invariably expressed sentiments of loyalty to the king." Now, Anagarika Dharmapala, this nationalist leader, he in a way instigated a violent attack against the Muslim traders in the country, and he was about to be arrested, and he writes this letter of allegiance to the British colonial secretary, expressing his strong, allegiance, which he says as solid as a rock to the British throne, but he will never be at peace with the Muslims and the others in the country. So what we find is this construct, which has been embraced by the working classes in Sri Lanka later on. And later it spread to the peasants. It spreads to the poorest of the poor in the country. And as a result, the Tamils, in a way, resisted non-violently first. Of course, that non-violent movement was led by a petty bourgeoisie, but an independent class. And then later, the resistance amongst the Tamils developed very powerfully. The resistance developed very powerfully. I'll conclude quickly. Amongst the Tamils who were not, the Tamil resistance was led by the Tamil Tigers, who did not belong to necessarily to the elite or to the traditional petty bourgeoisie. They came from the most exploited and the oppressed social classes within the Tamil community. And they built a state of their own, which had a massive, very impressive social welfare programs. And then it is this state which was totally destroyed with the British and the American support given to the Sri Lankan state, causing a genocide. According to the UN reports, around 70,000 people were massacred within a matter of 6 months between January 2009 to May of that year. And on the other hand, in Ireland, you find the peace process again facilitated by the British and the US states. And you find here exclusion of and the division of the working classes at the expense of thousands of people in Sri Lanka. You find.
We might have to move on, Jude.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for that talk. Thank you.
That is back to me. Thank you for that presentation, my brother. We now move to the final presentation, which will be delivered by Professor Andy Higginbottom, who is a professor at Kingston University of London, is a member of the Columbia Solidarity Campaign and the Marikana Miners Solidarity. This is somebody that I've been working with for the past few years. Excellent comrade and activist. Andy, please speak.
Okay, so I'm just now going to share my screen, and I hope this works. Yeah, so I was going to start with the concept of neo-colonialism, but I actually want to start with the deeds of the movement against racism, which we've seen starting with the terrible murder of George Floyd, but which really has been a very intense few weeks. Last 3 weeks have been extremely important, I think, in terms of our whole conception of what's possible in the world. And so I want to start by applauding the youth and the good people of Bristol. I say hats off to them, actually, and I think that they've shown that we need to press beyond the boundaries and the infrastructure and the mental limits which we've been constrained to for too long. Nigel Farage has been on the mass media. It's very hard to shut him up. He's going on about how Colston was a philanthropist without mentioning that all the black destruction of black lives, which the money came from. We have people like Keir Starmer seems to be agreeing actually with Nigel Farage that it was wrong for the protesters to bring down the statue. And now we have even Boris Johnson, who's telling us we shouldn't be editing history. Well, if Piccaninny, Letterbox, Boris ever needed an editor, he would be the one. But it's not about editing history, actually. It's about writing a very different history. It's about exactly what Walter Rodney did, which is to write a history from the standpoint of the oppressed. And it's not only about writing history, it's about changing history so that the dominant narrative, which is embodied in these statues, is no longer allowed to oppress the resistance of oppressed people fighting against racism and colonialism. And so what we have now is a moment of real sharp debate. And the debate has moved to this guy on the right, Cecil Rhodes. It's actually going to be harder to dislodge Cecil Rhodes, not only because physically he's on the third story of this building and sort of looking down on the high street in Oxford, but also because the establishment is undoubtedly decided to rally around and to stop this process of removing statues. And so we have Chris Patten, the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University, who's been saying basically he believes that he has the moral authority of Nelson Mandela, who did agree that there would be a Mandela Rhodes Scholarship, and therefore Patten argues that this amounts to a mandate from Mandela to keep Cecil Rhodes in place, which is a complete distortion, of course, because what Mandela agreed to was not the celebration of Cecil Rhodes. But even so, there is a question there, which I will come to, which is the question of what kind of deal Mandela did come to in the transition in South Africa and what the legacy really is. So what I'm going to say in the next short while is the statues should fall but we should not limit the discussion to the symbols of racism, of slavery, of colonialism, and of course, as we've been hearing, neo-colonialism. We do need to take the debate forward into looking at dismantling the very structures which those symbols represent. And it's the structures which have to fall as well. And so when saying Rhodes, you're next, what I want to say is the structures which both Colston and Rhodes built, you're next. The story inevitably does begin with Christopher Columbus. Of course, there was a history in the Americas well before Columbus so-called discovered them. But we also should celebrate the resistance of people in St. Paul, Minneapolis. First Nations pulled down a statue of him there. But also I've just seen actually across the US, there's been several such rewritings of history. Now, Columbus was a genocidal maniac. There's absolutely no question about it. Those who celebrate him are celebrating the man who, if anyone is responsible for genocide in the whole history of the world, this guy was. I mean, probably 50 million or more lives were lost as a result of his action. Of course, it wasn't just him, but it is interesting how history is taught. I have a Spanish school book which talks about how he was a great genius. And the mark of Columbus's genius apparently was that he worked out that he needed to make the Indians work. He needed to put them to work. Of course, the Indians either died or were crucified by his soldiers, as you see in the bottom picture, or they suffered in one way or another. And he didn't always get, Columbus didn't always get the Indians to work, right? But this genius actually was a slaveholder. He came from a tradition, the Genoese tradition of slavery in the Mediterranean and then off the coast of Africa. He married into a Portuguese slave owning family. I mean, he learned the trade of slave owning before he became the discoverer, so-called, of the Americas. So on almost every count, Columbus does need to fall. The big issue I really want to address is, although these two were quite awful individuals, I mean, personally, Colston owned 40 slave ships. That's where his philanthropy came from. But it's not only as an individual, it's also at the institutional level. He was the deputy governor of the Royal Africa Company. And as David Olusoga writes in The Guardian this week, I mean, what you see as an institution, how the Royal Africa Company was responsible for so many deaths, either immediately in the crossing or very shortly afterwards in the working to death in the Caribbean. Right? But even then, that's not enough. And by the way, I should just add, the Royal in the Royal Africa Company has got a very strong legacy to today. The deputy governor was Colston, but the governor was the Duke of York. The Duke of York, recognize that name? Prince Andrew is today's Duke of York. The British monarchy is built on the Royal Africa Company and similar institutions. So it's beyond institutional. The impact of this slave trade was completely systemic. The British Empire, the British capitalist system, was built on 200-300 years of slave trading and slavery. And in fact, the institution changed. The Royal Africa Company was superseded. It had the monopoly and it was superseded. And in fact, the slave trade increased from about 5,000 a year to something like 18,000-20,000 a year once its monopoly was broken. The historian to read on this par excellence is Eric Williams. He explains in very detailed, full, comprehensive way the many ways in which slavery benefited British capitalism. And the summary of that is very clear. This is systemic. It's not just personal, which it was. It's not only institutional, which it was. It is systemic. And the system includes at every level the British establishment, in particular Conservative Party, but not only them, right? The Conservative Christian Federation celebrate people like William Wilberforce, who they portray as a saint. In fact, what they talk about is the 30 years in when the British ended slavery and not the 300 years when they perpetrated slavery. Now, in fact, Wilberforce was quite a vacillating figure. In fact, Eric Williams writes about him in very harsh terms as being completely inept. And according to Eric Williams's story, in fact, Wilberforce did support the end of the slave trade, but he completely sought to delay the end of slavery itself. So there is a very important question of how the history gets written about the ending of slavery. Were the British the good guys? Was Wilberforce a deliverer? Well, in fact, if you look at the history from the Haitian Revolution onwards, you can see that what ended slavery above all was the uprisings of enslaved Africans themselves. The picture on the left is of the Demerara uprising in 1823, today's Guyana. Okay, it wasn't only that, it is also very true to say that there was a democratic movement here in Britain, and there were women, there were Quakers, they petitioned, they organized, the infant working class was involved. There was a democratic movement which supported the uprising of the slaves. So what you had is a coming together, and this is an important lesson of history, by the way, of the most oppressed and their allies. That was what ended slavery, British slavery. The slave owners were compensated. There's a really important website I invite you to go to, where you can see how much money was given as compensation, not to the slaves, but to their owners as a property holders. And it's not even the end of the story with Britain and slavery there, because in fact, Britain continued to get rich on the backs of slave labor. The configuration was different, but the configuration became that of slave-produced cotton. The British Industrial Revolution, the first 2/3 of the 19th century, was based on slave-grown cotton from the United States. And it's a very particular period, but you can begin to see the type of configuration which we today would call neo-colonial violence, where the British were not directly responsible for the violence, but they sure as hell benefited from it. So the brutal exploitation of African Americans ended up in the coffers of the City of London. And that's a type of arrangement which we will see gets repeated time and time again. And what Walter Rodney did in his analysis is to look at the entirety of the system. He highlighted it from examples. He started off with how the enslavement by Europe of Africans was the starting point of its underdevelopment. This is really important in terms of combating racist attitudes. It is nothing to do with the African character or African society that Africa is underdeveloped today. It is everything to do with Europe's exploitation of Africa for now 500 years. And moving on from the slave period, he and others like Samir Amin documented the different labor systems which the European colonizers used. And here we have the main types of labor systems which were used. The British in particular focused on the reserve migrant system. And also in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Rodney documents the emergence of what you might call modern working class, particularly in railways, dock workers, those type of industries, because those were the industries which was used to extract the wealth from the hinterland of Africa. So throughout his analysis, the exploitation of labor is fundamental to Europe's domination of Africa. And Walter Rodney takes this further into the post-independence period, especially in his later works, the Hamburg Lectures, and another lecture which I'll come on to very shortly. So what Walter Rodney does is he gives us a completely different paradigm, a completely different history. He's not editing history, he's giving us the people's history. The next, to give some background on Cecil Rhodes, fantastically rich. He's portrayed as a self-made man. Of course, he was made again by African labor, first in the diamond mines and then in the gold mines. He was a complete and utter imperialist and racist. He was a Cape Colony prime minister, forcing Africans off their land. He instigated the raids into the north from South Africa of Mashonaland, which subjected the peoples in that area of today's Zambia and Zimbabwe. He urged war to capture the gold reef from the Boers, and he famously had the vision of British Empire from Cairo to the Cape, right? So he was the founder of modern South Africa. And the colonial structures of exploitation that he set up still exist to this day. That's one of the arguments I'm going to put. Now, we should be following the example of the students in Cape Town. You see the picture on the left. They have got rid of one of the statues. There's still a massive statue in Cape Town, by the way, but at least one of them has been got rid of, right? But the structures, unfortunately, do still exist. I'll just give you one very quick example here. I hope you can all see it. This is the type of data which Walter Rodney used in How Europe Won the Developed Africa. I just came across this one recently, just to give you an idea. If you look at Northern Rhodesia, this was in 1945, Labour government responsible for this colony at the time, right, in mining European settler, or I don't even know if they were settler, they may have been contract workers themselves, but Europeans were being paid 18 times more than African workers. On average in the colony, that was 28 times more. This is the type of system that the Rhodes set up, and not one, but 2 countries were named after him. When African people fought for their liberation, they were fighting to get Europeans out of their country for political independence, but many of them were also fighting to end this type of exploitation. And Patrice Lumumba was exactly one such leader. And he famously gave a speech. He had to more or less push himself into the independence celebrations of his own country. After all, he was only the prime minister of his own country. But he did manage to make the speech. It's magnificently portrayed in the film, by the way, about Patrice Lumumba. And he clearly said that there will be no more exploitation. He said, we will establish social justice and we will ensure that everybody receives the right remuneration. Now, he only lived for 6 months after making that speech. His life, he was a marked man, basically. And the CIA, the French, the British MI6 were involved, all worked together with a local agent to have him killed. So what you have in Patrice Lumumba is an example of what the neo-colonial transition was all about, which was to destroy the militant Pan-Africanist presence and to use the destruction as a basis for having cooperative, moderate, corrupt leaders in their place. John Paul Sartre wrote a preface to Patrice Lumumba's speeches in which he names this. The purpose of this was to continue the super exploitation of African labor. And I think he was absolutely right to do so. Interestingly, the concept of super exploitation of labor, I think, is one side of the whole issue of neocolonialism. And very interestingly, this concept itself wasn't invented by John Paul Sartre. He was a conduit for the idea, which actually came from African Americans. So you can see on the top left, that's a picture of Claudia Jones and of course Angela Davis. And Claudia Jones was writing about the super exploitation of African American women back in 1945. And so what you have is this idea, not denying that white workers are exploited, but pointing out that African Americans, in this case, colonial subjects in other cases, and even more so women, are even more exploited because of the particular oppressions which they suffer. So what you have in this line of thinking is a presence of African Americans or Africans inhabiting the conceptual apparatus of exploitation. And the other strand of this, of course, comes from Africa itself. And these three were all absolutely essential writers involved in fighting against neocolonialism. And each of them contributes something to our understanding of it, especially the process of transition. That's Kwame Nkrumah, Frantz Fanon, and Amilcar Cabral. Now, Walter Rodney joins this debate. He is part of this debate. And probably more than anybody else, he combines these different currents in his own thinking. So in this lecture in 1978 in New York, he, as has already been mentioned in relation to Tanzania and the Pan-Africanist Congress and so on, he's already developing a concept of neocolonialism, which he subjects to a class analysis. And he says he's very both methodical, measured, but honest about the reality which he sees. And what he sees is an alliance between a new emerging class and the imperial powers. And the condition of that alliance is that the new elites in Africa or the Caribbean have to accept the predominance of metropolitan capital. That's the condition of the alliance. If they don't accept the predominance of metropolitan capital, then look what happened to Patrice Lumumba. That is what will happen to you. So the imperial power is still there, but also the alliance is to recruit the elite within the country to be a more effective operative of that imperial power. And of course, an alliance means that both sides have to want to enter into it. It's not imposed by violence, but it is present with a potential threat of violence behind it. Now, in terms of British neocolonialism, Lonrho is a corporation which is absolutely central to their project in Africa. Lonrho was formed in 1909 in Bishopsgate in London, but its operations were in southern Rhodesia, where it had mines and it had farms, all taken from Africans and profits made with African labor, of course. But it was kind of like a middle ranking colonial enterprise until the wave of independence in 1960 onwards. And in that period, Tiny Rowland was recruited to be the chief executive of Lonrho. And it was an amazing story. Within a few years, Lonrho was one of the 10 biggest companies in the UK. And the reason it mushroomed so quickly is because its business was corruption. Corruption was its business. So the job of Tiny Rowland was to go from one newly independent government to another, offering bribes and deals. And you can see on the bottom left that the board of Lonrho, these were the son-in-laws or the cousins or the nephews of politicians in ruling Malawi, Kenya, and so on. Okay, so it takes two to make a corrupt deal. The general narrative coming from the British mass media is, oh, look at Africa and look at all those corrupt people, leaders, and so on, right? The corruption is a relationship between imperialism and neocolonial rulers. And Tiny Rowland and Lonrho were the arch corruptors in the 1960s and 1970s. They set up a mining corporation in South Africa under the apartheid regime. They were so bad that even Ted Heath, a conservative prime minister, called them the unacceptable face of capitalism. So what I'm really trying to show here is that British capitalism evolved very quickly. There's lots of rumors that Tiny Rowland was actually working for MI6. The British state worked very quickly to get the benefits of the new independence period. Now we come to South Africa, which is a late arriver on the neo-colonial scene. The real dramatic evidence as a neo-colonial state came on the 16th of August 2012, when the South African police shot dead in cold blood, in open sight, before the television cameras of the world. They shot dead 34 striking miners. There were actually two massacres. One massacre took place before the TV cameras, and there was a second massacre which took place as they hunted down the miners as they were fleeing the firing squad of the police. It is incredible that those responsible have never been brought to trial. It is absolutely incredible that this frank alliance between the police, there they are at the top left, and the second massacre between Cyril Ramaphosa, who was recruited to the company's board in order to be a link with the ANC politicians in government, and thirdly, of course, the company itself, are all co-responsible for this massacre. None of them have ever been brought to justice. In fact, the Farlam Commission, which is supposed to investigate this, in effect, protected in particular Ramaphosa from any real cross-examination about his role. So what you have is a neo-colonial massacre carried out with an extraordinary degree of impunity for the perpetrators. So Ramaphosa is now the president of South Africa, and he's the one who urged the killing of all these men. How did it come about? And this is probably the toughest bit of my talk for some of you to swallow, but we have to deal with the reality and deal with it honestly, right? The ending of apartheid was itself a neo-colonial transition. The normal narrative is that the ANC government had very little choice. In 1993, it had to accept, under pressure, a neoliberal package from the IMF, and that has constrained the subsequent governments ever since. But this is really not what happened. I mean, the IMF was accepted, but it's accepted already based on a pact which had already been made. And again, there were three key actors which were pushing the ANC moderates to accept this pact. The first was the big business white monopoly capital. The second was the British government under Margaret Thatcher. And this is very frankly portrayed, by the way, by her point man on this, Robin Renwick. And the third was the South African intelligence, who really worked, as they had done on Kenyatta, so they did on Mandela, to groom the moderate wing of the ANC. Why? Because it was far better to have reform than revolution. Now, Mandela never compromised on apartheid, but he did make a deal about what post-apartheid would look like. And that deal was to defend private property. So post-apartheid is political equality, but economic inequality. And you can see it in terms of who the rich still are in South Africa. 5 of the 7 billionaires, are the biggest ones, are white. And now there are now 2 African billionaires, Ramaphosa and Patrice, his brother-in-law, Patrice Motsepe. So you now have 2 African billionaires to join the white billionaires. But what about the class structure of South African society? This will give you some idea. I'll just very quickly summarize it. Of the 3/4 people who could say are working class, 90% are black. Of the elite, 4%, 60% are white. So the 9% of the population who are white still predominate in the elite and the upper middle class. It's still a racially divided as well as a class divided society. You cannot really separate the two. This is the social outcome of the neo-colonial transition. And you can see it in terms of land ownership. Whites, 9% of the population, owned 72% of the land last time people measured this stuff. Africans, 8% of the population, own 4% of the land in their own country. This is the outcome of the transition. The other outcome of the transition is the degree to which Britain is still making money out of South Africa. This foreign investment, slightly out of date. The picture has changed a bit, but you can see that about nearly 1/3 of all foreign investment in South Africa comes from Britain. Britain is not only the mines, it's particularly concentrated in the banking sector. About 70% of all South African financial sector is linked to London, controlled by London actually. So we're now talking about, will Rhodes fall? Okay, well, we have to talk about the structures which Rhodes left behind. And the other side of neo-colonialism is that the profits come here. And so we have to look at the role that British imperialism is still playing in South Africa and across Africa. And we have to study what imperialism is. These big corporations are part of an imperialist system. And as our sister said, we have to particularly look at them in terms of their responsibility for climate change. And finally, I went to Colston Hall in 1976. This is my last word, okay? So I have to declare an interest where I saw Bob Marley and the Wailers. They were amazing, right? But what Bob Marley said was right, okay? It is a Babylon system, right? And we have to fight the Babylon system. That's what we have to do. And he, my last word, would agree with Walter Rodney on that.
Amanda, are you still there?
Yes, sorry. I need to, here we go. Sorry, Andy, can you let go of the share screen, please?
Yeah, sorry.
No worries. Okay, thank you for all of those presentations and for a wonderful set of commentary and questions offered up for each of our panelists. Now, I would like to note that in real time, we're at we're past time, just at 5:03, but we will keep going. My instinct is to ask one question per speaker. How do people feel about that? Or should I ask all of them?
One question per speaker will do.
Okay, all right. Sounds about right. Okay. Fair enough.
Sounds workable.
Okay. I still see Andy's PowerPoint, so if you could get rid of that.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Okay, so there were, just for those who are on the live stream, I have kept all of or most of your commentary, and I'm actually going to share it with the speakers afterwards. If you don't hear your question, I do apologize, but we are over time, and the questions will get to them anyway. And there is a way to keep in touch with us. I've posted the Gmail account. You can also like the current, not the event page, but the group page for Facebook, and we will probably rename it and keep going. Okay, so the first question is for Kevin from Frederick Collins. He says, if the post-colonial administrations were just as prone to state violence, to what extent is state violence a natural logic of power? It was present in Greece as it is in China today.
I think the basically violence and state violence and monopoly question as like a broader political theory question about powers. I think I can't answer that adequately right now, but I think to address basically, let's talk about the police force and what is the role, for instance, of the police been, and it has been the suppression of workers' movements, for instance, and the disciplining of laborers to facilitate the emergence of a capital or like the development of a capitalist system. So we have that in the UK, for instance. That's how kind of the police developed, and that's how they were employed. We have the same thing, or we have a similar thing in the US, where the police developed from slave patrols in the South and slave management systems in the North, all of which kind of serve, or in Kenya even, we have the police deriving from a colonial force that was basically put in place to manage African labor. So we do have this kind of thing of, specifically, I think what I'm trying to talk about is if we have a state monopoly of violence and we have a neo-colonial state, that will of necessity enforce neo-colonial interests. And the capitalist state is basically founded on this form of violence. But I don't know if I can go into basically the broader political theory questions about the state and violence, because I think that's, I can't adequately address that right now.
Thank you, Kevin. So this is, the next question is for our Bolivian sister and brothers. Do the panelists anticipate the current global uprising against racist structures to catalyze revolution in the indigenous population of Bolivia in the context of the Áñez coup government and its brutal repression of indigenous and workers groups following the coup, as well as the recent news that the elections won't be held? Thanks.
Hi. Yeah. Well, there was two positions about to anticipate this racial violence. The government thought they had under control because the economy was doing very well, and they thought the capitalists wouldn't dare to disturb this economic growth. They believed they managed to seduce the imperialist puppets that we have here, and that would be okay. But the grassroots with the activists also was divided. Some people said, no, we have to carry on working as with our Pacific revolution that we were on, and in the future, we, the young people, will take over and will have control as a socialist. And the other ones, we were more cynical, and we said, you never go into a fascist. You will never win to your side. And when we were arguing that, suddenly, out of the blue, the coup d'etat came. Countries like the UK was the first to recognize the coup government, was to legitimize this government of Agnes. And 6 months it happened. It was the last 6 months. Up to now, we're still trying to recover psychologically what happened to us, why we went back 50 years back in history. We are like in the 40s. People, racists are beating up indigenous people in the streets. All this. We thought that we got over of that, but obviously it was a mistake.
Thank you. Okay, so a question for Jude Lal. This one from Olajumoke Adiyanju. Sorry if I butchered your name, for Jude Lal. Thank you for connecting the dots with Tamil resistance movement and colonialist land ownership construction. What would a national liberation struggle in hindsight mean in the Tamil context? Can't hear you.
Thank you. The Tamil liberation struggle had already two phases. One was the nonviolent phase, which was adopting Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha model. That was in the early 50s and the 60s. The demand was to make the state more liberal, to treat the Tamils as equals. But as that was brutally repressed, then the demand evolved to a separate state with a militant liberation struggle. Not only that, it also created a state with, as I mentioned, massive social programs, which had very clear socialist features. So that has been destroyed militarily. But now what remains is a political struggle, which is again under attack by the British and American imperialism, to the extent of not allowing the Tamil diaspora activists to use the word Tamil Elam, which is a term that evokes the liberation sentiments and freedom fighters, while the same imperialist governments are aiding and abetting Sinhala colonization of the Tamil homeland in the north and east, with massive military presence. So that is where we are at the moment. But to conclude, even in the midst of the coronavirus lockdown in Sri Lanka, they don't call it Sri Lanka, like in India and Sri Lanka, they call it curfew, blanket curfew, which is managed by the military and the police, which was used as a tool of repression. The Tamils gathered to commemorate the massacre that happened in 2009 on the 18th of May by social distancing themselves. So you could see the Black Lives Matters and the communities of solidarity across the US and other parts of the world amidst the pandemic come to the streets, and the Tamils too, in the midst of the military control lockdown or curfew, came onto the streets to commemorate, and some were arrested. So this resistance continues, but on the other hand, you can see amongst the Sinhala working classes, the military and the president are being glorified for achieving the military victory. So that is where we are.
Thank you. Okay, we have a final question for Andy from Mohammed El Naim. Is the concept of race capital useful, Dr. Higginbottom? I'm seeing even the EFF in South Africa is saying that the Black bourgeoisie has a progressive role while it attacks the Guptas and Indian monopoly capital. I'm sure that our brothers and sisters and kin in Guyana can tell us where this road leads.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of what the EFF are doing in that regard. I mean, I didn't go into the detail, but it is true that Asians kind of like fit at an intermediate level in terms of the structure of apartheid and post-apartheid. But it's also true that the real issue is not sort of a form of racialized nationalism in that sense. I really do believe that there's a lot of EFF rhetoric which is using the Pan-Africanist rhetoric, but is actually needs to be quite carefully. I mean, I support the Pan-African program. I want to be very clear about that. But I mean, you know, that you can no point trading one form of populism for another, in my opinion, right? And I'm very disturbed that EFF leaders were meeting with Robin Renwick, for example, in fancy restaurants when they come to London. So I'm more in favour of African nationalism, which I'm completely in favour of, which is more heavily accountable to the working class, the African working class. And I don't believe, sadly, I wish it were otherwise, I really do, but I don't believe the EFF has proven to be that.
Okay, thank you. That's all we have for now. So it goes to Kevin now.
Yeah, I think Amanda's pretty much said how you can get in touch with us through the email. It'll be, or like the Facebook page as well, if you haven't registered in Eventbrite. We'll try and stay in touch with everyone. We'll kind of try and build these discussions, because I think we've had so many important kind of comments on the YouTube stream, and there's so many different conversations we can kind of have here. And I'd like for us to continue having those conversations for as long as possible, to build, organize, make connections between the different continents. So that would be great. So just please do get in touch. And we will be doing something of the sorts again. We had a conference last year already. So if you're thinking this one was long, that one was much longer. But yeah, we will be doing this again, hopefully next year. And yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending and participating and joining this important, really important discussion. Thank you.
Is there a way that we can talk amongst ourselves, which is offline?
End the stream now, and then we could talk.